Excellencies, fellow leaders, I believe that many of the answers lie in our partnership. In a more confrontational global economy, Africa and Europe need each other more than ever before.
European leaders are taking stock of their economic partnerships amid global tensions, and Africa is emerging as a strong contender. CGTN's Julie Shire reports.
And this is what brings us here to Luanda. Today we can look back on the progress achieved since our last summit, but more importantly, we will look forward to new opportunities to work together. As old friends, business partners, we want Africa and Europe to be partners of choice.
We cannot continue as a countries and continent whereby we send our resources to be processed in other countries, which means we are importing jobs of our young people.
This country shouldn't be where it is. This country shouldn't be in debt. There's no way. It is unjustifiable. I cannot, by the life in me, understand why we are where we are. I cannot. I refuse to embrace this unpleasant reality. I refuse. I am a persistent objector to this conventional and mundane existence. And yet we are sitting on trillions of dollars of mineral wealth. But it doesn't work. The Washington consensus is absolute nonsense. Don't come to me and tell me government must not get involved in the arena of production. No, I don't care from what school of economics you get it from, Chicago school, whatever. No, it's absolute nonsense. It doesn't work. And it will not work here. So let's try something we may even not know. Because the knowledge economy is an experimental economy.
A quiet but dramatic power shift is unfolding between Europe and Africa, and it is rattling capitals across the continent. Europe needs Africa more than it has in decades. For energy, for raw materials, for migration control, and for geopolitical relevance. But this time, Africa is not negotiating from weakness. African governments are pushing back, rewriting terms, and rejecting old arrangements that once favored Europe almost entirely. What used to be dependency is turning into leverage, and Europe is running out of options. For most of modern history, the relationship between Europe and Africa followed a familiar script. Europe set the rules, Africa supplied the resources. Trade agreements, development aid, and political partnerships were designed around a simple assumption. Africa needed Europe far more than Europe needed Africa. That assumption no longer holds. Today, Europe finds itself in an uncomfortable position, dependent, exposed, and increasingly reactive. Energy shortages, supply chain disruptions, demographic decline, and geopolitical competition have converged at the same moment, and at the center of all of it's Africa. Europe's energy reality tells the story first. After years of relying heavily on external suppliers, Europe's access to cheap and stable energy has become fragile. Conflicts, sanctions, and shifting alliances have forced European governments to scramble for alternatives. African gas producers once treated as secondary partners suddenly became critical. Algeria, Nigeria, Libya, Mozambique, and Senegal moved from the margins to the center of Europe's energy calculations. But Africa noticed something important. Europe's urgency had grown. Deals that once dragged on for years were suddenly rushed, diplomatic visits multiplied, promises became more generous, the tone shifted from instruction to persuasion, and with that shift came a realization among African leaders that leverage had quietly changed hands. Energy was only the beginning. Europe's green transition depends heavily on raw materials Africa controls. Lithium, cobalt, manganese, rare earths, these are not optional inputs. They are the backbone of electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, and modern electronics. Africa holds a significant share of these resources, yet for decades exported them cheaply while importing finished technologies at premium prices. That imbalance is now being challenged. African governments are increasingly demanding local processing, technology transfer, and equity participation. Exporting raw minerals alone is no longer acceptable. If Europe wants secure access, it must accept new conditions that place more value, jobs, and control inside Africa. Europe's discomfort grows here because these demands strike at the heart of its economic model. At the same time, demographics are reshaping the equation. Europe is aging, its workforce is shrinking, its pension systems are under strain. Africa, by contrast, is young, fast-growing, and increasingly urban. Migration, long framed as a problem Europe manages, is now a reality Europe depends on, whether publicly admitted or not. For years, Europe relied on African governments to act as gatekeepers, limiting migration flows in exchange for aid and political support, but that leverage is also changing. African leaders now understand that cooperation on migration is not a favor, it is bargaining power, and they are using it. Trade adds another layer to the shift. Many African countries are reevaluating agreements that lock them into exporting low-value goods while importing high-value European products. The rise of regional African trade, new financial institutions, and alternative partners has reduced Europe's dominance. China, the Gulf states, India, and others have expanded their footprint, giving Africa options it didn't have before. With options comes confidence. Europe's traditional tools, aid packages, preferential access, political pressure no longer carry the same weight. In some cases, they backfire, reinforcing perceptions of unequal treatment and outdated attitudes, and Africa is no longer silent about it. Public rhetoric has changed. African leaders speak more openly about sovereignty, dignity, and fair exchange. Policy frameworks increasingly emphasize self-interest rather than dependency. The language of partnership is being tested against reality, and where it fails, it is being rejected. This is where Europe feels the pressure most, because Africa's shift is not coordinated by a single bloc or ideology. It is organic, uneven, but unmistakable. Country by country, sector by sector, the old assumptions are being questioned. Why should Africa accept rules it didn't write? Why should it prioritize European needs over its own development? Why should historical ties override present realities? Europe, for the first time in generations, does not have easy answers. The world it was comfortable in, where Africa had limited choices and Europe held structural advantages, is fading. In its place is a more competitive, multipolar environment where influence must be earned, not assumed, and this is only the opening phase. Because what comes next will determine whether Europe adapts to Africa as an equal partner or continues to lose ground in a relationship it once dominated. As Africa's leverage became clearer, Europe's response shifted from confidence to calculation and then, increasingly, to concern. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It crept in through multiple channels, each exposing a different vulnerability Europe could no longer ignore. Energy was the first fault line to crack. Europe's energy security, once buffered by long-term assumptions and diversified suppliers, now rests on fragile ground. African gas and energy producers have moved from being optional partners to strategic necessities. Countries that once struggled to get European attention now find European delegations arriving urgently, offering revised terms and accelerated agreements. But Africa has learned to read urgency. When negotiations suddenly become flexible, it signals weakness. African leaders understand that Europe's need is immediate, while Africa's resources are enduring. This time, the bargaining table looks very different. Demands for better pricing, infrastructure investment, and local participation are no longer dismissed as unrealistic, they are treated as conditions. Europe's discomfort grows because energy dependence is not temporary. Even with aggressive renewable targets, Europe cannot transition without stable inputs, and many of those inputs come from Africa. Solar, wind, and battery technologies all rely on minerals that African countries increasingly control. This is where Europe's green ambitions collide with Africa's economic awakening. For years, Europe promoted environmental standards that limited Africa's ability to industrialize using its own resources, while Europe itself had already developed using fossil fuels. That imbalance is now openly challenged. African leaders are demanding the right to develop on their own terms, not according to timelines set in Brussels. And Europe is running out of moral leverage. The second pressure point is trade. Africa's role as a supplier of raw materials has always been central to Europe's prosperity. What has changed is Africa's willingness to remain stuck at the bottom of the value chain. Governments are revisiting contracts, renegotiating royalties, and introducing export controls designed to force local processing. Europe's response has been cautious but revealing. Publicly, officials emphasize partnership and cooperation. Privately, European firms warn of rising costs and reduced competitiveness. The fear is not simply losing access, it is losing control over pricing, standards, and supply timing. Africa understands this fear. By insisting on processing minerals locally, Africa shifts jobs, technology, and profits inward. That weakens Europe's industrial advantage while strengthening Africa's bargaining position. It is a strategic move, not an ideological one. Then there is migration, the most politically sensitive pressure point of all. Europe's domestic politics are increasingly shaped by migration flows, yet Europe cannot fully control those flows. Without African cooperation, Border agreements, transit controls, and return arrangements all depend on African governments playing along. But Africa no longer sees this cooperation as automatic. Migration control has become leverage. African leaders understand that Europe's internal stability often depends on decisions made far beyond European borders. That realization has transformed migration from a liability into a negotiating tool. This is deeply uncomfortable for Europe because it exposes a reality European leaders rarely admit publicly. Europe needs Africa's cooperation as much as Africa once needed Europe's aid, and aid no longer carries the same weight. Financially, Europe faces another challenge. Development funding and investment once flowed almost exclusively through European channels. Today, Africa has alternatives. Gulf states, Asian economies, and new development banks offer financing without the same political conditions. That doesn't mean Africa prefers one partner over another, it means Africa can choose. Choice changes everything. Europe's traditional influence relied on scarcity of options. That scarcity is gone. Diplomatically, Europe is struggling to adapt. Statements that once carried authority now sound defensive. Calls for shared values are met with demands for shared benefits. Lectures about governance and reform are increasingly questioned when they conflict with economic self-interest. This doesn't mean Africa rejects Europe. It means Africa is redefining the relationship and Europe is being forced to respond in real time. What makes this moment particularly destabilizing for Europe is that Africa's shift is not centralized. There is no single bloc, no unified command. Instead, countries are acting independently, guided by similar conclusions. That makes the shift harder to counter and harder to reverse. In some cases, Europe has tried pressure. In others, incentives. Neither approach works the way it once did. African governments now calculate risk differently. Short-term backlash is weighed against long-term sovereignty, and increasingly, leaders are willing to absorb pressure if it means breaking free from arrangements that no longer serve their populations. This is the core of Europe's anxiety. Not that Africa is hostile, but that Africa is confident. Confidence transforms negotiations, it shifts timelines, it changes who waits and who demands. Europe is discovering what it feels like to negotiate without automatic advantage, and the consequences are spreading. European companies are reassessing Africa strategies. Political leaders are divided between those who recognize the new reality and those who hope it will fade. Voters sense instability without fully understanding its source. Meanwhile, Africa continues forward. Regional trade is expanding. Industrial policy is becoming more assertive. Public discourse increasingly centers on dignity, control, and long-term growth rather than short-term aid. This is not rebellion, it is recalibration. And it leaves Europe facing a hard truth. The era of setting the rules without consent is over. What comes next will depend on whether Europe adapts or resists, because Africa has already made its choice. Europe can no longer assume Africa will comply out of habit, history, or pressure. That era is gone. What replaces it will depend entirely on choices being made right now quietly, urgently, and often behind closed doors. Africa is not asking to be included. Africa is deciding. The continent is choosing when to cooperate, when to negotiate harder, and when to walk away entirely. Energy, minerals, migration, trade, these are no longer favors. They are bargaining chips, and once leverage is understood, it is never forgotten. For Europe, this creates a dangerous crossroads. Adapt and treat Africa as an equal partner with real power at the table, or resist, cling to old rules, and watch influence slip away deal by deal, country by country. Because here is the uncomfortable truth many in Europe still avoid. Africa does not need permission to move on. Other partners are waiting, other markets are open, other paths exist. The question is not whether Africa will change the terms. It already has. The real question, the one that should worry Brussels, Paris, and Berlin, is whether Europe is prepared for a world where Africa no longer plays along, no longer waits, and no longer accepts relationships that benefit only one side. So here's the warning. If Europe misreads this moment, it won't lose Africa overnight. It will lose it slowly, contract by contract, vote by vote, deal by deal. And by the time the loss becomes obvious, it may already be irreversible. Now the conversation shifts to you. Is Europe finally adjusting to reality, or is it underestimating Africa again? Let me know in the comments, because this next chapter will be written by the choices both sides make and by who understands the power shift first.